I was just saying it was a real pleasure to be here, and what I would like to do in this talk is Roy asked me to outline some of these ideas around reproducibility, what it means when computation is involved in scientific research, and so that's one of the things I love to talk about, so that's in a lot of my talk. It's probably, sort of even listening to the conversation when I came in at lunch, it's probably a little bit long. It's about 50 minutes. And what I'd like to do is maybe I'll stop a little bit early and we can have sort of a more free-ranging discussion. And also the other thing I would like to invite you to do is interrupt me with comments. This doesn't relate to my work. Here's how we think about it, all of this stuff, and how do we apply it here. And even if we sort of stop on a key slide and it engenders a whole half hour of discussion, I think that would be a very wonderful and productive use of the time, rather than me kind of blazing through stuff that doesn't seem to resonate, for example. Okay, a couple of other things I wanted to mention. So I just recently moved actually to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so no longer at Columbia, so I wanted to make that correction.
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. I didn't tell you, so it's my fault. And so my PhD is in statistics. So I did my PhD at Stanford in the statistics department, and then I did something that's a little bit unusual, which is I then went to Stanford Law School after finishing the PhD. So some of that comes out a little bit in this talk. It does come out of my work kind of more broadly understood, but if you do have questions about licensing, code release, and all of this stuff, and intellectual property, and how that interacts with reproducibility and transparency and so on, it's not the focus of my talk, but I'd be, of course, happy to talk about it. Okay, so let's get started. So why does reproducibility in computational science deserve our attention? So what I was going to go through today is fundamentals, and I think when we think about these issues, the right thing to do is step back to foundational issues in how we think about what distinguishes science from other types of activities that we might engage in. And really at that point, when we have this sort of principled understanding of what our goals are and what we're driving for, we can see whether or not this matches with what we're doing in computational science generally understood. So that leads to my next point. So how does computation start to interact with this idea of what we're doing as science? And many of our ideas about science were laid hundreds of years ago, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And computation, barely we've been grappling with this in science for 20 years. And so we've got all these kind of new issues that are coming up, which are actually the focus of my research. I find fascinating, and I think you are all starting to grapple with them as well. And so that's the third point. What happens when we start to see conflicts with the way that we're using computational methods and using computers and sort of really big systems, and what we're trying to achieve in terms of ideals as scientists producing scientific research? And then I'll finish with some solutions, ideas. These are, in a sense, very new issues. 20 years is new, and probably really quite new over the last 2 years in terms of being something that people are regularly discussing. So it's just sort of sketches, outlines, and lots of room for brainstorming and so on. Okay, so I thought I might start in something that was published in 1942. So this is Robert K. Merton's enumeration of scientific norms, and they themselves are not without controversy. So I'm not putting them up here as some kind of this is what we always do, but it's one of the touchstones that people often use that might spur some thinking as well. So I'll go through them quickly. So the first one he mentioned was communalism, which I think he called it communism, which didn't really play well. But scientific results are the common property of the community. Universalism, all scientists can contribute to science regardless of race, nationality, culture, gender. It's about the ideas and it's about merit. Disinterestedness, we're acting for the benefit of the common scientific enterprise rather than for personal gain. Originality, scientific claims contribute something new. Skepticism, so scientific claims must be exposed to critical scrutiny before being accepted. So the two that I'm going to focus on primarily in this talk is communalism and skepticism, although they all kind of come into play, and certainly feel free to bring any into the discussion. Okay, so the implementation of these norms, probably the last significant change that we had to how we conduct, carry out, disseminate, and communicate scientific research happened in the 1660s with the formation of the scholarly societies in England, and like the Royal Society. And at that point, this is a picture of Robert Doyle. At that point, there was a lot of discussion around, well, how do we communicate science? What is the right modality? And Doyle was the first one who actually said, we need to write things down in such a way that other people in the community, sort of our peers, people who are educated in the work that we're trying to communicate, can actually go ahead and replicate the experiment. And he found that out from experience, trying to replicate vacuum experiments with the air pump and finding, sort of cursory descriptions or no descriptions and just claims, very frustrating, as you can imagine. So I lean here on the norm of skepticism. This requires that our scientific claim can be independently verified. This in turn requires transparency in the communication of the research process. Okay, so now the advances in technology used for scientific discovery have changed how scientists effect reproducibility. It's also changed, the internet has changed how we can communicate this as well. So technology at all levels is affecting what we do and how we reinterpret these norms in our current settings. So I probably don't need to tell you guys this stuff, but I throw it up here just as a sort of measure of magnitude of the types of changes that we're talking about.
Actually, you do.
Okay, I'll go through this. So I like to think of the changes in sort of three groups, some degree overlapping. The first one I'm sure everybody here has heard about, it's probably been on the cover of magazines and so on, is data deluge, that we're a society of data, we're collecting data like fiends, data science is the sexy new thing to do, and so on. And just for some examples, so one of the projects in the Large Hadron Collider in CMS are collecting, when the collider's running, they're collecting 780 terabytes a year, and then they process this and it becomes into the petabytes. And so now, even I just mentioned this ideal of having transparency. How do you have transparency when it's not like I'm going to sort of, click around and download the data and look at it or something? We're just in a whole different world. The Sloan Digital Sky Survey, so their 9th data release, I think is their last release, was a mere 60 terabytes, pales by comparison with Large Hadron Collider. But again, it's not something you're just going to put on your laptop and just kind of like figure out or take a look at one evening and kind of know what's there. There was an article published in Science in 2009 that folks here may have seen, talking about a quantitative revolution in social science due to the abundance of social network data and how these fields were transforming now to become primarily quantitative research-oriented fields because of this amount of data. And NIH created an associate director for data science in 2014 with one of the primary missions of that office to manage the enormous amounts of data that are now being shared and stored, particularly by NIH, but with this goal of reproducibility and transparency. Okay, so that's one that probably sounds somewhat familiar, but there's two that people talk about a little bit less. So the second one is we've also seen an enormous increase in compute power. And this has introduced new ways to actually ask questions and answer them in a number of disciplines. So for example, we can now do complete simulations of the complete evolution of a physical system, change the parameters, run another simulation of the system, and so on, and actually start to learn about our physical world in this way. The third one that I hear almost no one ever talking about, but I think it's just as big, is that now many of the deep intellectual contributions to science are encoded in the software, and they're actually not appearing anywhere else. We think of them as sort of a default as appearing in the scholarly record, but I think it's a big shift that now software is as much a carrier of these intellectual contributions as in the academic paper, for example. Okay, so let's ground this a little more. So thinking about the scientific method and how do we map these norms to our traditional thinking about how we carry out science. So we've always had these, well, always meaning for the last several hundred years. Traditionally, we've had these two branches to the scientific method. And the first one is deductive reasoning. So for example, mathematics and logic. And the second one, which actually was one of the advents that spurned the Royal Society, is empirical or inductive reasoning. And so here we have this whole machinery of statistical analysis of controlled experiments. So now there's a lot of talk, and you've probably heard it in keynotes or grant proposals and so on, around these ideas of these third and fourth branches of the scientific method that are coming from these changes in technology that I just enumerated. So these computational branches, a third branch in large-scale simulations, fourth branch in data-driven computational science. This probably sounds somewhat reasonable because I just gave some sort of very high-level examples on how we can actually learn new things using simulations versus and also doing data. Yes?
Yeah, I've had some HPC people say that simulation is not a place where you can find science, in the sense of,
Perfect.
physics. I'm not going to understand new properties of physics. I can maybe explore some ideas, but am I really going to create science with a simulation?
Right, so I think this is exactly why I'm here.
Counterpoint from the Department of Energy A is computational biology and proteomics. So Deb saying counterpoint from the Department of Energy to the issue of simulation. When I spent time there, that is one of the core investments that they consider for advancing science of the future. So the notion is that things like computational biology, you can do things with computers and simulation that cannot be done any other way. And then also, if you look at much of the work in the proteomics, diving deeper into one of those subjects. And I would argue that much of what's done in the power grid as well could not be accomplished without the simulation and modeling.
So we're basically one slide too early with these
Okay.
topics. So just hold this for 1 second, but this is exactly the type of discussion that I'd like to foment.
Not my position. I just heard that asserted by physicists, at least.
Yeah, no, we'll get back to this. Okay, so right on the bottom of the slide here, I have an argument that I'm going to present to you and see what you think, and I'm getting a sense of what you think already. Okay, computation presents only a potential third and fourth branch of the scientific method, and I've written a little bit on this. And so what does that mean? Okay, so I actually dug around on the web, as you can see, because this looks like it's from roughly 1995, and it actually is. So this is a workshop put on by NIST, a modeling and simulation in NIST multi-laboratory strategic planning workshop, and that was September 1995. And because you can't read it on there, I pulled out the relevant text that made me put it up here, and it says, it's now common in 1995 to consider computation as a third branch of science, besides theory and experiment. Okay, so that was interesting. And then on the other side is a recently published 2009 book. I think it was sponsored by Microsoft or co-edited by folks, but there were lots of different authors in there. And right in the preface they say, so the book is called The Fourth Paradigm, and right in the preface they say this book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. Okay, so you might think, what are they talking about here? Okay, so the way that I think about this and start to unpack this is I think about why we do science and why we have these transparency. I go back to these norms and what kind of underlies them. And the first one is thinking about the ubiquity of error. So our motivation in the scientific method is really to root out error. It's a recognition that whenever we're carrying out any type of scientific experiments or discovery activity, we're making mistakes all the time. It's not just because we're human and we make mistakes, but we just live in this world where we're trying to control so much, and it's just always this mistake-riddled process, in a sense. So our job as scientists, in a sense, is to try and convince each other I've done everything I can to make this as error-free as possible. And so what this has meant is that in the deductive branch, they've come up with this idea of the proof. So you don't give a mathematical result, unless it's Fermat's last theorem, without the proof. And everyone kind of knows what this means and what a standard proof, I mean, sure they couldn't fight about details and so on, but what a proof means generally can get agreement and so on. And that's just part and parcel of how they actually communicate their work to each other. In the empirical branch, now we have, it's not quite as cut and dry, we have a machinery of hypothesis testing and a very structured way that we carry out and communicate the methods and the protocols that we followed in doing the research. And this is clearly evident if you look in publications. There's a methods section, and most journals will require this methods section, and you have to fill it out. And the idea, of course, is this notion of transparency, reproducibility, rooting out error. Can I understand what you actually did? So here's the assertion that computational science at a very high level, as practiced today, is not generating reliable knowledge. Instead, we have these breezy demos of results. This algorithm worked, look at these results, characterized by the inability to reproduce findings. So this is something that is changing, and people are sort of taking this seriously and making big steps. But at the moment, I think this is probably an accurate claim. And what I'm going to do is spend the next few minutes trying to flesh out why I think that is probably inaccurate. Okay, so over the last maybe 18 months or 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion around this. You've probably seen this word reproducibility flashing through your inbox or, in journals and so on. And I think that it's touching on these notions of this credibility crisis, and you can see how far-reaching this is. So I grabbed a few things from Science and Nature. These are all, I think, within the last year. So Science, Marcia McNutt, editor-in-chief, with a whole discussion of reproducibility, just titled Reproducibility, and so she thought this warranted an entire article. In Nature, there's an announcement regarding our irreproducibility. Nature also saying we must try harder and do a better job of achieving our norms and standards. And then it's also kind of made it out into the popular press. You can see the LA Times up there, science has lost its way at a big cost to humanity. And The Economist, a special issue from last October, I'm sure many of you saw, how science goes wrong. And so I put these up here to say that it's not just an inside baseball discussion that we're having anymore. It's something that really the public perception of science is also actually at play here. Okay, so much of what the articles on the previous slide are talking about are sort of clinical trials, drug discovery, and issues around this. This is really what, I mean, if there's one part of science the public really, really cares about, that's it. But, so I found it helpful in discussion, since I know this isn't, you guys don't do farmer research, to really kind of pull out the different pieces of the word reproducibility. I think when different communities start thinking about what it takes to make their work reproducible, it's quite different depending on the type of research that they do. So the way that I thought about it is I found it helpful to think about empirical reproducibility. So this is it's a little bit small, but that's the Nature article. Reducing our irreproducibility, must try harder. This is the stuff of boil, is the way that I think about empirical reproducibility. Are we even, after all these hundreds of years, including enough information in the scholarly record where I can actually go ahead and reproduce your work? Or should we be doing a better job? Should we have expanded methods such? Should we make more use of the internet and in the way that we communicate? But fundamentally, I don't think there's anything new in the sense of technologically driving these changes. However, they are still big problems. The second phrase that I found useful, or modifier I found useful, is computational reproducibility. So this is all the stuff that I've been talking about, where we have machines now involved in this discovery process, and how does that actually change how we think about what it means to root error out of the process? And even the word error has a completely different connotation when you think of a computational system, for example. So I'll come back to the sort of the little article there, setting the default to reproducible in computational science and building up to it.
I have a question. I'm not sure what the difference is between computational and empirical. I mean, I think in terms of reproducibility.
I'm thinking of empirical like a wet lab.
Yeah, but I mean, empirical is a algorithm in a context, and computational is an algorithm in a context.
I would put that in computational. Yeah, so if you're using a computer, let's just throw it in computational. That's the way I've been thinking about it.
Yeah. So I'm not sure where the difference in error is. It's a bug.
Right. So right. Did you want to comment on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Or I can just summarize briefly, because I know you wanted to make a comment, which is if we're trying to root, okay, if I get it wrong, let me know. If we're trying to root out error, empirical and computational reproducibility have overlap because they are using software, right? And there are bugs embedded in both processes. I was just trying to distinguish software into computational reproducibility.
Yeah, I think it's useful to point out that a lot of people in the computing arena think that computational reproducibility means hitting return again on the same program, on the same data set,
Yep.
in which case, why bother? Because you're going to get the same answer within some, small computational error.
Are you really going to get the same answer?
Well, you might not. But I think this is a position that a lot of people take. A different way to look at it is that reproducibility doesn't mean just pressing the button again. It means doing the entire experiment all over again, possibly using, maybe different materials, different subjects, and then doing the subsequent computation as necessary. It means doing the whole thing again, not just hitting return.
Okay, so this is a great point. So it usually comes up a little later in the talk, but let me just take this on right now. So that's, I think that's exactly right and exactly key, but let me give you a thought experiment. So you have a publication, and I go and I do the independent replication, and I go out and I have new subjects, I write all the code from scratch, and we redo everything, and I get some answer, and it doesn't happen to exactly match your answer. So there's a couple of issues that come up. You might not expect it to, right? But you would expect it to be maybe in the ballpark. So the first question is, how close is close? So in order to understand what would be considered evidence versus counter-evidence with your previous publication, I need to understand where I've introduced error into that process so that I have a handle on how much variability. Maybe it is just machine variability or core failure or something introducing error, and so I can have very small tolerances here. Or maybe it's actually something much larger. If I've done a survey and I have a very different sample at a different place in time, I might expect much larger kind of variation in the output. And so I think both of these go hand in hand, and it's not an either or. So I think the person who said sort of hitting return and regenerating the figures in your table, that's just not even a contribution in science. I think they're right. So you haven't contributed sort of anything new or bolstered anyone's results. However, that's basically what I'm going to need to be able to do that, to dig into why our two independent replications are actually different, and understanding, decisions you may have made that differ from mine, and then that gets us back to rooting out error in that discovery pipeline. So I think they actually go hand in hand, and they're both parts of the same coin for the computational reproducibility. We need to be able to, as much as possible, get as close to that ideal of sort of hitting return and being able to just chunk through someone else's code, presuming I can inspect the code and it's not a black box.
So maybe just to illustrate that, I have had occasions where I couldn't remember which button to press to recreate the figure on the paper. So that's still,
It's still hard?
Yeah, it's still hard.
So one of the biggest arguments for reproducibility, even though I've couched this in this larger sort of scientific, ethical, quasi-ethical framing, is for yourself. When the journal editors or reviewers get back to you and say, well, what about that weird blip in figure 4? And you're just, how did that get there? So being able to even just go back yourself a week or two later and being able to do that replication is really important. That sort of, step through replication even. So I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'll jump ahead in the interest of time. So my own research as a PhD student, we did most of our work in MATLAB. We released MATLAB scripts and whatever data was attached, and we were statisticians, and so we generally we sort of had data sets that would allow us to illustrate the methods. We didn't particularly have overly complicated empirical data sets. So it was, in a sense, we had this easy case of releasing data, releasing code, and allowing the community to go ahead and check this. And part of it is being able to, the motivation is having new students come into the lab, for example, and being able to pick up and start contributing new work without having to spend a year or two, and I'm not even exaggerating, figuring out what the other students have done who are gone, right? And if they had been working in this reproducible fashion, you can start getting new results within a week or two versus a year or two. So there's all these practical, benefits to this. However, I think without this sort of principled understanding of why this is important, I think, if I just stood up here and told you it was really, really good and science would be better off for it, somehow that's just not compelling because we've all got day jobs and deadlines and so on, and we need to kind of understand why we're doing this. So, are there other questions on this point? Okay. All right, so I'll just mention statistical reproducibility. So I put this in here because there's lots of discussion about whether correct methods were used, understanding perturbations in data, or the instability introduced into scientific discovery by your choice of statistical methods, for example. This is an ongoing place of research. And so I think that's another category of where reproducibility might actually fail. So those are my three, although I think your point about reproducibility, sort of hitting return versus independent reproducibility is extremely well taken. Okay, so my advisor was David Donahoe. So he is, I put a paraphrase here of some of the work that Professor John Claerbout, emeritus professor now in geophysics at Stanford, had done with really reproducible research. So John Claerbout was Donahoe's inspiration for doing reproducible research, which I inherited as a student. And Claerbout was the one who decided he would no longer sign a student's thesis unless he did have that hit return and then have the thesis recreated on their system. And the idea was exactly to get the next students in and producing stuff quickly and not sort of waste funders' time, students' time, everybody else's time. So I'll read this out to you. The idea is an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data which generated the figures. Okay, so I think we've seen this actually. So you're not meant to necessarily read this slide, but what I wanted to do is just illustrate that there are lots of different communities who are starting to grapple with these issues of what it really means to do reproducible science in when they're doing very computational science too. So lots of stuff here with HPC community grappling this, psychology, math, law, and so on, and computer science and so on, psychology as well. Okay, so there's been a couple of discussions around this issue that actually go back probably to 2009. One of the most recent ones was at ICERM, one of the Brown ICERM workshops, and it happened in December of 2012. So a group of people, I think there were around 70, not just computational scientists, but journal editors and funding agency folks, and people kind of got together. And they were talking about reproducibility in computational and experimental mathematics. And I was one of the co-organizers. And the reason I mention this is because one of the goals of the week-long workshop was brainstorming a report which had sort of comments on the state of the art and then recommendations and discussions of available solutions and so on. So that's the report on the left here, setting the default to reproducible. And it was spawned a couple of sort of discussions and so on that you can see on the right, including in SciAm. Okay, and that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. One of the things that we talk about in the report is how many tools have cropped up, again, in the last 12 months, 18 months, to try and help with these issues of reproducibility. And I grouped them, so there's more than this. I didn't try to get a complete list. There's so many, they keep popping up. And I grouped them into 3 groups. Roughly, these are overlapping, but they seem to sort of be clustering as dissemination platforms. So what do you do if you have some work, you want to share code, share data with this. The journal doesn't really publish this, so how do you kind of connect all these together in some persistent way? I've been working on the first one, Research Compendia, that I'll just discuss briefly in a couple of moments on how to disseminate and link code data and your paper. And then there's another family of tools, workflow tracking and research environments. And by the way, my slides are on my website, and these are all hot linked, so you can just jump in at any point if you're curious. And I highly recommend that. They're just fascinating. These are wonderful tools to see what people have done. And one thing I'll mention too is most of these are just academic researchers doing stuff on the side because I think it's important. This isn't, there's a couple that have industry support, but it's not like industry came in and wrote a bunch of stuff to help and here's the selection. This is just people not even really particularly rewarded for this stuff, just trying to do it because they think it's the right thing to do. The final category is embedded publishing, so producing this document that has some sense of reproducibility inside the PDF somehow, like you can click and reproduce figures or blow open code and so on. So there's different ways of putting those together. Okay, so one idea with Research Compendia is what I wanted to do is set up a persistent web page that would link out to the publication and allow people to grab code or grab data. And the idea was to do this sort of chunk through and can you actually even get the figures in the paper. I mean, you make it sound like that's actually really easy. But I think with most of the papers that are out there, even if you have code and data, it's not necessarily straightforward to do it. And without the code and data, it's quite difficult to actually regenerate those figures. It's just the paper itself doesn't, it's not that there's, malfeasance or anything. It's just the paper's just, it's 4 pages. What can you actually put in there about all the complexity in your computational research? So the idea is linking code data to the publication, and we can run it actually and do this sort of third-party verification, do that sort of step through, and hit return, and do I get your results? Okay, so I'll move, that's just an example, but I'll move through this relatively quickly. You can see the buttons down here, grab code, grab data. This one happens to be an open access article, so you can actually grab the article itself. And it's all sitting on GitHub open source, so it's not meant to necessarily steer you there, but just be, again, useful tools for the community. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, we're sitting here in DC, about sort of pushes that are coming from Congress, coming from the White House that will affect, through the funding agencies and through the research in the federal agencies, how we actually carry out, how we share, and how we disseminate and reuse research. And my own instinct on this is the sort of page of tools that came from the research community is probably the right way to go in some sense, rather than having, politicians kind of jump in and try and tell us that it's got to be this way and that way. However, I'm sure you've all been sort of thinking this along one line or another, which is, wow, that's a lot of work to put all my code together with my data at the time of publication. Journals don't really require it, and I do get promoted based on papers, and that's what all the prizes and more funding comes from, and so on. So why would I put code and data together to make a reproducible output when I'm literally going to hurt my career because I'm taking time away from creating more of those papers that I can list on my CV and so on. And I think this is changing a little bit, but that's not an irrational perspective, especially when you're young or pre-tenure, for example, where you're judged on your papers. So we do have this collective action problem. So on the other hand, I think some of these initiatives from the White House can take steps if we are on top of this and we react consciously and so on as the scientific community, but can take steps to break that collective action problem. Because of course, if we could snap our fingers and everybody was producing reproducible research and code data, you wouldn't have this problem where it's actually it's hurtful to produce it, for example. So anyway, I'll mention these to you. What's coming is already kind of out there and also coming down the pike. So in February of 2013, the White House, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, issued an executive memorandum, and all the funding agencies, I think they had to have more than $100 million in funding or $500 million or something, but all this so that's basically all of them. They were all directed to, within 6 months, develop plans on how they were going to provide access to publications and access to data. So I haven't talked about access to publications at all here, and I think it's an important issue, but in some sense an unrelated issue to reproducibility and sort of the scientific integrity issue. But of course we've been talking about access to data, and so everyone in this room probably noticed that they didn't talk about code. Right? So how is that moving us towards reproducibility? I can have your data and your results, and that's better than having no data and your results, but that's still going to be well nigh impossible, actually, to get your results if I don't really have a sort of very clear idea of what you've done. Okay, so those plans were due in August of last year. My understanding is they're very close to something or another happening, meaning the White House will have some input from OMB on the expense, and we might see some announcement any time now, although it's been that way for a few months. So something may be happening there. Later on in 2013, the White House said, well, if the research is in federal agencies themselves, you just need to make your data available. We're not even going to have a plan. Just go ahead and actually make it publicly available. And this is subject to legal issues like, for example, HIPAA protections and privacy and so on, which probably this community is very sensitive to. It's this area of research now, and one of the things that I'm very interested in is how do we actually take data sets that have kind of privacy constraints in them, legal barriers to research, and still be able to bring some of this idea of reproducibility to bear. Can I, for example, authorize people into a particular system that allows some reproducibility or some independent verification of results, or are there sort of intermediary grounds? And then can we kind of break open this idea of data being closed or data being open through more clever infrastructure? So continue on. In July of this year, there was a notice of request for information on strategy for scientific innovation, and I'll get to that in one moment. There was a point in there about reproducibility. But notice that our work as scientists is being shoehorned into this context of American competitiveness, right? This isn't really framed as research as a public good in its own sense, where we started the talk. It's now framed as almost a kind of a jingoistic, we've got to beat our rivals, not in science, we have to beat them in terms of economic growth, and all the research that we fund as science will allow products to develop and so on. Not that, I love economic growth as much as anyone, but it's a different framing to what any scientist in the room might find familiar, for example. Okay, so this is the executive memorandum expanding public access to the results of federally funded research. I'm going to go through this very quickly and just mention the one about strategy for American innovation. So point 11 here, so this was July of this year, given recent evidence of the irreproducibility of a surprising number of published scientific findings, how can the federal government leverage its role as a significant funder of scientific research to most effectively address the problem? So they're trying to get into the weeds of what we're doing. So that was July. They've received the comments. I think comment period closed in September, so something or another may happen. So it's out there at many levels. It's not, the concern is not just in this community or in this room. It's across many different communities and right up through to the sort of the top of the funding agencies. Okay, and also I won't spend time on this, but of course Congress, in passing their initiatives and acts that fund NIH and fund NSF, for example, and fund DOE, are also exerting influence. And I won't get too much into it, but there's been a lot of discussion recently about open data and the EPA and so on, and what does that mean, and sort of very stylized debates like this have the potential to sort of flavor how all of us have to conduct research. Yeah.
Back up one slide. Do you have anything to add about that last report?
About the unfunded mandate? So this is really an interesting point. So we see this discussion happening at the White House, happening in Congress, and it almost always is, so any sort of executive memorandum is almost always prefaced with, no additional funds may be used to satisfy this goal. And that's a very big problem. So that you're faced with this draconian choice of either adjusting how a funding agency like NSF actually allocates its research, because if it needs to support things like preserving data or preserving software over time, for example, then that takes funds. And at this point, they're explicitly saying that there are no funds for this, you just have to find it from within the pool that you've already got. So these are challenging and open questions. So I put this on there with the hopes that people in the White House and Congress see this. Because I'm not convinced it necessarily has to be all that expensive, but and different communities will certainly, some will be more expensive than others, but certainly this isn't something that we have to shy away from or sort of, it's something that needs to be taken seriously. Yeah.
In terms of innovation, the U.S. government's the benefactor. The U.S. government's the benefactor of a lot of science, so
Yeah, sure, of course.
benefactors get to call the shots. Get to call the shots. What's your sense about, can innovation take place with marginal reproducibility? As a taxpayer, I gotta say, well, is it worth the cost?
Yeah, it's a very, very good
sort of
question.
thing?
Yeah. So I think this goes back to fundamentally the way I would think about it. It goes back to how we started framing the discussion, which is, so computation is new in a sense, and can we do better than traditional reproducibility? Computation, you're probably capturing much more of the sort of steps and tacit knowledge in your research than was possible when it was, say, like, rocket development or something like this, where really reproducibility meant someone from that lab went to the other lab and literally showed them. It wasn't coming through the paper. And that's just, we're kidding ourselves thinking that we had reproducible research around that back in the day. And so I think that's how I would try to understand why things are different now, that we need to think about reproducibility differently, because the computation sort of pushed us into this new space where our environment doesn't actually support us. But it's questionable in many cases whether we certainly have not had full reproducibility up until now, for example.
So maybe the way to frame it is that reproducibility has been a missed opportunity to accelerate innovation because we've done such a poor job of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the computational space, I'll make an argument, I mean, I just spent time saying that it's not easy, but I'll make an argument that it's relatively speaking easier than, a video camera maybe with, a physical experiment, for example. I mean, we do, it is kind of in some sense there. It may not be in a shareable form, but we did type those commands in, and in theory, it's shareable, and we can put stuff out on the internet. So, and so I think it's more than a missed opportunity. It really is something where we can get this together, and then in a sense, I could almost argue that sort of the pre-computational research, we could explain this in a way that people sort of understood the sort of flow of discovery and so on and what the process was. Code is just so dense and so complex for most of these experiments. You sort of can see the output and get a sense for what was done. But digging into the weeds of like what were your parameter settings, or how was the code written, and so there's just so much more complexity now. I think it kind of deserves our attention more than as a missed opportunity, in that we're publishing stuff that's just not even verifiable and probably wrong. Okay, that wasn't provocative enough. All right, I'll continue.
No, we just accepted it as true.
Okay. So just a couple of other little pieces of background. So here at National Science Board, they had a report that came out in 2011, Digital Research Data Sharing and Management. They haven't, in my opinion, haven't done much, or at least I haven't seen much come directly out of this so far, but it's percolating around at places like NSF and so on. And of course, we're all aware of, like NSF, data management plan, which I just wanted to just point out how this comes out of these funding guidelines that have actually been around NSF, and also NIH has some too, where I found one back to 2005, and if I was really aggressive with the archive, I could probably go back further, just saying that NSF expects investigators to share with other researchers data, encourages grantees to share software and inventions or otherwise act to make the innovations they embody widely useful and usable. And NIH expects and supports a timely release and sharing of final research data from NIH-supported studies for use by other researchers for their big, like over $500,000 grants. But still, this is language embedded, and there's largely not enforced and not acted on. And so my impression, if you look at the language in something like a data management plan that NSF is requiring, and NIH has started to require some software management plans, for example, so this is coming up too. It seems like they're trying to get a handle on how do they enforce what's already in their grant guidelines. Okay, and I put the DOE public access plan up here too, but won't spend time discussing it, but there's a link out. This just came out a couple of weeks ago, so you can see how DOE is starting to manage access to data, for example.
So there are two things there. One is access to data, and the other is software.
Right.
And my question is, how do you encourage people to get beyond ego when it comes to sharing software? Because I know when I was a grad student, I wouldn't have wanted anyone else to see my code, and I wouldn't have wanted to publish it anywhere.
Right.
The algorithms are one thing.
Right.
So what kind of mechanisms could be put in place?
Well, so there are some mechanisms in place. So you saw the grant guidelines saying that they support this, but that's weak, we know. But if you want to publish in science, you're making your code available, not your algorithm, for example. So I actually have some slides. I can jump to them. They're in way at the back here in case someone asked this question about what are journals doing around. There's journals moving quickly, actually, not just to data disclosure requirements, but software disclosure requirements, so that you get this kind of step-by-step ability to reproduce. And so it does have ramifications for things like, well, I'm a scientist, I'm not a software engineer. I'm producing toys in a sense. Like, these are supposed to be kind of hacky things. If you want to bring this out to market and have real development and sort of product folks around it, fine. But that wasn't what I was trying to do. And so it does raise these hosts of issues around, well, if I release my software, I get barraged with email and people trying to install it and the thing and this, and I don't want to deal with that either. And so I think it's just a sense of kind of scoping what our responsibilities are over our software. And stuff that's not professionally developed is just fine. And just fine. Yeah.
So you mentioned marketing, productization of research. So there may be another disincentive for people to share the code if they want to make money out of it later on.
Yeah, so I can talk a lot about, you can see all my slides now, I'm cutting them off. I can talk a lot about that actually because that's a legal issue too. So let's see if I can So there we go. Okay, so why don't people want to share code and data? So I did a survey, and these are top reasons. It just is a pain in the butt to clean up and make it usable by others, and basically I don't get rewarded for that. It's by far the top one. But then fairly quickly, like fourth and fifth, are things like, well, I might want to patent this, or there are copyright issues, and there are other legal barriers to sharing. And so this is actually a, sorry about this. Yeah. It's, this is a whole entire talk in itself, but because of Bayh-Dole that was passed in 1980, which, by the way, was when people were not thinking about computers being used in scientific research at that point. The idea was incentivizing the sharing of these results, and they thought if universities could actually have patent rights over the discoveries and inventions that are happening within the university, that will encourage disclosure through the patent system. And so now, one of the arguments that I make in a different talk is that with reproducibility, this is actually now creating a barrier to sharing, which is exactly what you're pointing out, because if you accept that in some ideal sense that we have the results accompanying with software, accompanying with paper, accompanying with data as part of our publication, then wanting to withhold that software because I may want to put it in the patent system is a barrier, not just in that it creates delays, but I mean, I can imagine, like, all researchers, if you have to do any more than click, like if I have to call a tech transfer office and have a conversation with someone to get software, it's just like not happening. Right? I may as well be dead. You know? And so I think that's a real issue, and it's one of these cases where the technology has gotten ahead of the IP law. But however, I am also watching the space, and there have been a number of recent cases that have sort of rolled back software patents a little bit, so we may see changes on this. And this is actually the reason why we didn't see software in the original OSTP memo saying release your data and release your articles, because software has now, because it's potentially patentable, has this sort of special case within Bayh-Dole. So see, it gets complicated really quickly. But fundamentally, I think as researchers, we can just get ahead of this and do research.
The question is university issue business
Yeah, so I don't have it actually in here, but I do have some empirical results on that. They don't patent that much software yet. Most of these tech transfer offices are around drug discovery. That's where a lot of the money is, and sort of bioengineering and so on. And but they're starting to figure it out. And so I think we just need to get ahead and get these sort of protocols in place where we really share software as a de facto way that we publish our findings.
And so one of the things I didn't see on that slide you were just flashing about why it is that people don't want to share their code. I think one of the big reasons, I would think, is that it would be potentially highly embarrassing and force a retraction of the paper if you found out that there's some bug in your code.
Yeah, okay, so that's two really important things. So that is kind of in there in the top one, in time to document and clean up. But the idea that there could be bugs that would force a retraction in stuff that's published and it's just buried now, doesn't that kind of make people feel a little weird?
But isn't that just the point?
Right. Right. So that would be a good thing, I would argue, right? Yeah. Yeah, so if it's not required, why release it? Because you may see a bug in there that you didn't even know about, like you might have vested intentions, right, of course. So that's another reason where, as a collective action issue, we kind of need to sort of move together and get these protocols in place for the entire community. Because we're going there.
So in my misguided youth, I was a patent examiner.
Okay.
And I was an examiner prior to the time that the courts overruled the office and held software to be patentable. I have not followed very much, except as an expert witness in a number of software infringement cases. But I have yet to see a software patent that, when really pushed, was declared valid.
Right.
Have there been any, and what were they?
That's a good question. So I don't know of any, but however, I think the chilling effect is not just in the enforcement. It's in, and I could actually turn this around on you, which is, well, what patents that universities have taken out have actually paid off? It's a very small number. Yeah, and the tech transfer offices, right, so my understanding is the tech transfer offices don't even cover their own expenses in general. And so, but that doesn't stop them from going ahead and doing it.
Sure, they've got a job.
And they're encouraged to do this through Bayh-Dole, actually, that are encouraged to use the patent system to do this. So that's just a mismatch between our norms and these kind of norms that have come from Congress, which was also the subtext of me showing you all this stuff that were in that area again. Yeah.
You mentioned the word retraction. certainly nobody wants to be in a position of having to retract their paper for any reason. But it's interesting to point out that in computer science and computer security, the mechanism for publishing is largely conferences, where a retraction is in some sense just plain not possible.
Right.
And that presents a problem as well.
So I agree, but I also think that's actually maybe helpful in the sense that some other solution is going to have to come into play, like a more richer dialogue in terms of how papers are updated or how there are corrections and so on. I think that's something also that I just wanted to mention also this conference, this was this summer, and how Exceed, which some of you may be interested in or know about, which is they kind of do, I'm hopelessly going to butcher their mission, but in some sense middleware that allows users who are not HPC specialists to actually access the resources and run big jobs. So they have this kind of middle layer, which seems like a very intuitive place for reproducibility. And I think this is also, this idea is also where something like we can do better than retractions. We can sort of build on and recognize that all code has bugs, right? And start to not be so black and white about fixing problems in the literature.
So a lot of life, possible retraction.
Where do you retract it?
Yeah,
Conferences ultimately,
There's
that's
a
what I would say.
publisher that follows the deadline. Or a publisher put it off.
Well, so the other thing,
It's already published, right? It's already out. There's just not a tradition of retracting this community, and they're not really informed.
So I have a follow-up on Roy's that might lead into this answer. In that case, pontificate a bit on what you think a good retraction system might look like for
well,
computation.
so I think that we're actually talking around the issue a little bit. So one of the things that came up in this discussion with Exceed is, well, what's the right infrastructure to have in place? And in this discussion, and they have sort of this stylized, because there's so much infrastructure in this, so it's a very concrete example. But in the discussion, people were like, well, I don't know what you mean by reproducibility. We're not going to virtualize blue waters, for example, so what's the kind of middle ground? And one of the points that came up was, well, so in a sense, the end goal is reproducibility, even that sort of hit return and get the right answer. But what's important is that even if people don't end up doing that, is that we work as if we're going to be producing that type of reproducible research, and we sort of maximize this. And so I think those changes, like you mentioned about the retractions and so on, just having that, like that, even if, we don't actually, do, like, basically knowing that gearing up to share code and data is what I'm trying to say, makes you do better science as you're going through. And so the idea that sort of the probability of uncovering these bugs, if people know that they're headed for sharing software and sharing code, will go down even if nobody checks the stuff. That's my conjecture. Convoluted way of getting there. Yeah.
We should let you carry on with what you plan to say.
Yeah, let's,
Oh, no.
let's comment and then
I
we'll
just have my
No, no.
follow-up, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not an end user, CMP kind of guys. So it goes back to how do you stand on the pretext of best intentions? If there's a flaw, there's a flaw. Who peer reviews your code to make sure those flaws are not narrow minimized?
Yeah. So I think we're getting ready for a discussion of how to recheck code. For a lot of the discussion in reproducibility, I think this would have just frightened people off. Reviewing is enough of a burden anyway, let alone actually trying. Could you imagine installing someone else's stuff and like trying to compile it and so on? And so, but things are popping up. So one of the ideas in Research Compendia is, so if we are hosting code and data, we can run the stuff, so we can become this third-party intermediary. It doesn't stamp your science. I mean, you can hit return on crappy science all day long, but at least we can kind of do that and get the same figures, and so you've got that, right, as at least as your baseline. And so I think we like these small innovations, it's a hard system to change, and I don't think that the right thing is to sort of throw out the way one thing is done or another in terms of publications and so on. But these kind of incremental steps, I think, are the way to go in terms of code data requirements with publication of journals that they're adopting, and how we do sort of the verification, and let's innovate around that. Maybe it's something that happens in the peer community, you run it, and then there's a way to do feedback. Like here, it doesn't show on here, but we have these ideas of comments or, version control. Of course, we can just sort of submit bug fixes and so on. And that's not embedded in the scientific scholarly record as yet. But these solutions are all floating around. I mean, this doesn't seem like it's not huge leaps to start knitting them together. I think so I'm optimistic that that will come. Okay, well, it's 2. So I'm happy to keep blathering on, but I actually enjoyed the discussion.
Oh, we would also be happy if you collaborate.
Okay. I have a couple questions.
We have until 2:15.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like there's the timer right over there.
Okay, so I don't have my glasses on, but okay, there's a question here.
We want to do 10. Yeah, we can do another 10 minutes.
So I'm sold already, but and we are publishing data sets codes in my group selectively though. So because I'm a tenure track, I put on only what I think is the most impactful work I'm doing. And but one of my students is here, and we had a discussion with the whole group about reproducible research and how would we could go forward with the group and actually get all our work in the pipeline. And I got the kind of room full of, are you an idiot? It's kind of like, what are you? What is the professor now
Not
talking
idiot, but
about?
optimist, maybe.
So I'm just wondering. So how? What would you be your advice to kind of internalize this within research groups? So how to move forward? What are the best practices,
Yes, that's a great question. A question with a fairly long answer too, but because of course how groups work are largely individual, not just by the field, but also even within the field they tend to have different styles and so on. But there's been a reasonable amount of work. Let's see if I can. Oh, here we go. Recently with things like, IPython notebook and these kind of interactive ways that you store the relevant pieces of code, whatever worked in generating the figure as you go through, and you can use Markdown and actually sort of mostly write your paper as you're going through. So things like that I think are can be useful in some settings. Of course, I don't know exactly what your setting is. This may not map to it, but by the way, it's agnostic to language. It's not just Python. But things like that. I know I had. I had a sort of a way that I would generate scripts in MATLAB. Again, this was going back to my my statistical research, which may not map exactly to the type of research you do, but we had rules like one script per figure, and it would sort of call subscripts and so on, but it was named this way that we knew that we could go in and sort of dig out that figure for that paper, and everything was in a folder for that particular paper. Many people really advocate being creative with GitHub and so on, and having that as I'm forgetting the name of it now, but there's software that allows you to sort of look at what folks are doing on GitHub or whatever your version control system is. And I know there are professors who do that, and that's how they sort of see what postdocs are up to, like what's been checked in and so on, and they can see the progress on the papers and so on. And it's not like a draconian monitoring, but it's also a way of getting things organized and organized in cyberspace. And so I think it's sort of being creative around these things, but I know that this is changing, and tenure and hiring committees are starting to say where's the code and where's the data, and this is actually becoming an issue. And there's a cultural issue, I think, with young people, which is, so my impression has been a little different from that, which is they are often discouraged by the fact that they come from often very digital environments where they are very well versed in sort of open source software, and then they land in scientific research, and there's very little mentorship and people kind of ignoring, and I'm not necessarily in this community, but in, for example, bioinformatics, the software side of things, and it's generally not shared, and then they find this actually is a discouraging part of how we carry out science, and in fact it's confusing to them. And so in a sense there's sort of these integrity issues. And so usually the push kind of comes from the young people who want to do this, and you almost have to kind of say, well, make sure you get tenure, make sure you're getting those publications out. It's not on you, it is on the senior people. I don't know if that was helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a
question about something that you kind of touched on a couple earlier, about the privacy issues with
Yeah,
data sets.
yeah.
This, I think insecurity is one of the biggest issues. In some cases, we just have data sets that, are, network traffic or something like that we're not allowed to release.
Right.
What kind of, and you mentioned that was a big research area for you.
Yeah. So I don't think I can get online, but I actually just published a co-edited volume, and I think it's at dataprivacybook.org. And so we had lots of different authors coming in to talk about, and it was less focused on, say, cybersecurity and more on, so what are the legal barriers and what is happening in a policy context and sort of what are some of the solutions that the federal agencies are doing. It was more like that angle. But this idea that we could have secure systems where people can do certain types of queries that would match or map to reproducibility in some sense, if you can't have the data or code open, then you can't have it open, for example. So we need to innovate around these other solutions. So that's something where I'm actually hoping to work more with cybersecurity folks around this, because I think this is where there's this huge opportunity to really kind of bring a lot of the tools that were historically on sort of computational systems, really bring it into these privacy issues around science and reproducibility.
So you're referring to basically able to interact with the data without being able to look at it?
Yeah, or so there's some innovation in that area. So for example, if I query something and it comes back with a little bit of noise, how many queries can I do before I've actually kind of uncovered the one patient with AIDS or whatever and identified them? And so things like that, and can we do things that are that can support some kind of access? And I don't, of course, have all the solutions, but I think this is something we just have to, we're going to have to grapple with reproducibility and all the sort of medical and with confidentiality issues. One thing that I'll just throw in here too, which is not quite related to your question, but sometimes in collaborations with industry, the industry will kind of say, well, it's our industry data and you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement and so on. And I think we're in danger here of the same thing happening as open access, where journalists say, here, sign your copyright over to me, and you sign, not you personally, but all of us, we all sign, when there's no need to sign it. All they need is a license to publish, and they're grabbing all these rights from us. And so I think I want to sort of be careful with how we're interacting with industry when really reproducibly I have to get your Facebook data or whatever it is data in order to be able to verify your findings. And so that's another place where we can start building these bridges. But I'm not trying to say that industry doesn't have any legitimate concerns, but can we sort of be, again, more creative rather than totally closed or like 100% open? Yes.
Yeah, I sort of got distracted in that, but I think that while working in this area of trying to share data without sharing it and preserving privacy and so on is laudable, the problem is that almost any technique you apply to the data to do that renders it unsuitable for some particular analysis.
Sure.
And the general result is that you can't keep everybody happy all the time. And I have never seen a case where any attempt to really preserve the confidentiality of everything that might be sensitive in the data succeeded against people who really wanted to get it there.
Yep. I think that's the danger, right? So the usual argument, sort of the counterpoint to this is, well, norms are changing anyway. And people are becoming less sensitive to, but the laws aren't changing, right? So I'm certainly not saying I have all the solutions.
I would actually argue that the privacy is overrated here. We willingly give commercial entities information we forbid the government to have, and that strikes me as being the heart of hypocrisy. Either give up on privacy or say, no, damn it, I have a right to facts about me, I have a property right in them, I own them, if you want to use them on a case-by-case basis, you may ask me and pay me what I think it's worth to solve your problem.
Right. So you get into these issues like, well, what's actually a fact about you? And a good case in point there is, well, your genomic data. It's also facts about other people, like your relatives, for example. So you sort of start to blur who owns what and so on. But I take your larger point about the hypocrisy, and one of the things I think that we'll have in the next 2 or 3 years is a sort of more coherent, hopefully more coherent, but national discussion around what on earth are we doing with our data. I mean, most of us are so insulated from our medical records because they're so incoherently spread across whatever doctor we've seen in the last 20 years and so on. So how do you even sort of think about even sharing that if I wanted to, for example? And who owns this? The docs, the people who preserved it, people who put it in the infrastructure, me, or what? researchers. So anyway, so there's all this sort of these funding agencies maybe supported the research. There's sort of these issues that will quickly come to bear on a discussion like that.
I'd like to just ask if there's maybe one last question, and if not, we'll let Victoria wrap up, and then we'll be moving on to the next panel. Any other questions here? Victoria, maybe you have some summarizing remarks?
Okay, well, I'll go to my last thing here. Okay, just things to think about that are on the horizon. So all of these statistical issues and how we do inference from data, I think there's a tendency to sort of, this happens mostly at the policy level, but to think if you've got data, therefore you've got reproducibility. And I think how you actually do inference from the data, particularly when we're in the big data context, is incredibly important. And this engenders to me this sort of knitting together of code, data, and also these results. And we've seen this huge growth in tools and supporting infrastructure to enable different versions of what reproducibility might mean in that community. And so I'm very optimistic that this is something that will be resolved in most communities. Where you have huge amounts of data or really big confidentiality problems that of course creates other issues, but I'm extremely optimistic about this. New issues for scientific communities to think about is how we reconcile conflicting results, or what defines a conflicting result. And that goes back to our earlier discussion around how do we trace back where we've actually introduced error into the process that we've enacted in doing the discovery. How does the computer enter into this as a tool of scientific investigation with its own error associated with it is brand new in most communities to start thinking about. Okay, and the final point that I'll make is this idea of, utility and standing on the shoulders of giants, and how can we reuse software. Again, I don't think that we're responsible for making the software work for all people in all situations and so on. It doesn't even have to be beautiful. It could have like 7 for loops in it or something. But just sort of getting it out there and letting other people take it and improve it if they want. You sort of put it out as is, and people and I think the audience is the other researchers in your community. And then that's where we start actually delivering this more reproducible research. So I think what I'll do is actually stop there. I'm very happy to take questions. There's quite a bit, as you can see, to talk about, but there's a few references, and as I said, the talk is on my website as well. So I'll leave it there.
Gosh, I feel like I hope we didn't ask you to stop prematurely. There's like so much more interesting stuff.
No, this is perfect, actually. The discussion, I think, is much more important than dead stuff sitting on my website.
Great. So as many of you may be aware, I've been around for a while. I'm going to look at me and know this, but I started my career in highly reliable systems where sources of error were a major concern. Now they're still a major concern, but for other reasons, which Victoria has very nicely touched on. So her talk and her material, her wise words, apply, I think, much more broadly than just in our own community. And I would like to personally thank Victoria with all the rest of us. I think one of the hallmarks of a really great talk is it changes the way people think. And I think that it has changed the way we are looking at what reproducibility means and why it's important. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.